She fell asleep on his shoulder in the carriage, and he didn't move for 3 hours. I have told this story at dinner parties, at club suppers, at the weddings of men I do not particularly like, and once, memorably, at a christening, which perhaps was not the ideal occasion. My wife has begged me to stop. My brother has threatened, on more than one instance, to have me removed from functions at which he is present simply to prevent the retelling. I ignore all of them. I think the story deserves to be told, and I am the only one who saw the whole of it clearly, which, given that my brother spent the critical portion entirely motionless and trying not to breathe too loudly, perhaps disqualifies him as a witness. My name is Lord Edmund Calloway, younger brother to His Grace Alastair James Calloway, the Duke of Strathmore, and I am setting this account down at last in ink so that it exists in some form beyond my memory. I am not a young man. Memory has a way of acquiring gaps at inconvenient moments, and I should not like this particular truth to fall through any of them. The year was 1847. The season was ending, and my brother, the most feared and least charming man in 3 northern counties, was about to be undone by a woman who did not know who he was, had not intended to enter his carriage, and was too exhausted to care about either. Alastair had not always been what society made of him. I should say that first, because the legend has a tendency to swallow the man, and if I do not put the man on the page before the legend arrives, the legend is all anyone will see. He was 8 years my senior. When our father died, I was 12. He was 20. Alastair became the Duke of Strathmore at an age when most men of his station were still losing at cards and calling it education. The estate was not ruined exactly, but it had been mismanaged with a kind of cheerful consistency that had left the tenants cold and the roofs uncertain, and the debt, while not catastrophic, required several years of very quiet living to address. Alastair addressed it. He did not complain, he did not explain. He reduced the household, renegotiated the estate contracts, dismissed 3 stewards and replaced them with 1 competent one, and sat through enough meetings with solicitors and land agents to have earned, in my view, a great deal more credit than he ever received. What he received instead was a reputation. The cold Duke of Strathmore, the Highland Duke, the man who had not danced at a single ball in the last 4 seasons, who attended only those functions that served a practical purpose, who looked at debutantes as though they were columns in an account ledger, and who had said at one notorious dinner that the London season was a marketplace of poor goods at inflated prices, and that he saw no reason to participate in it. He had not been wrong, that was the problem. People generally forgave you for cruelty. They did not forgive you for accuracy. He was not, in truth, cold. He was simply very, very tired, and he had learned, after several years of being misread by people who wanted him to be something warmer and easier and more flattering to their own ambitions, that the effort of correcting the misreading was not worth the reward. I understood him. I was the only one who did, I think, with the exception of Mrs. Alderton, his housekeeper at Strathmore House, who had known him since childhood and treated him with the same firm affection she had shown when he was 11 years old and had climbed onto the stable roof on a dare, and then discovered he was rather less confident about the descent. Everyone else had decided what he was. He had stopped arguing. I should also tell you about the season of 1847, because it provides the context without which the story makes less sense. I had dragged Alastair to London for it. I'm not proud of the method I used. I told him I had a legal matter requiring his presence, which was true only in the loosest interpretation, since the matter was a contract review that his solicitor was perfectly capable of handling without him. And the real reason I wanted him in London was that he had been in the Highlands for 14 months without interruption and was beginning to resemble, in both demeanor and conversational range, the Moors themselves. He came, he endured the contract review with his customary efficiency. He then looked at me and said, "The legal matter appears to be resolved," in a tone that suggested he knew exactly what I had done, and that he was going to sit at that dinner table long enough to make me feel it. "There may be additional matters," I said. "There are not. There may be social obligations. There are none I cannot discharge in a week. There is Lady Westhaven's ball." He looked at me for a very long time. Lady Westhaven's ball was the event of the season, and attending it would constitute, in the eyes of society, a declaration that the Duke of Strathmore had re-entered circulation after his long Highland retreat. I knew what that would mean. The mothers, the introductions, the careful parade of eligible daughters, the whole grinding machinery of a marriage market in which Alastair was the most desirable and least willing participant. "If I attend Lady Westhaven's ball," he said at last, "you will owe me a significant debt." "I accept." "I have not named the terms yet." "I accept anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, there was a small movement at the corner of his mouth that someone who did not know him might have missed entirely. "You are reckless with your debts, Edmund." "I have faith in your mercy." He did not reply to that, but he came to Lady Westhaven's ball. He lasted 3 hours. In those 3 hours, I watched him be introduced to 7 young women of impeccable breeding and variable intelligence, 2 of whom were genuinely charming, but who could not quite conceal the fact that they were more interested in the duchy than in the man, and one of whom burst into nervous laughter every time he spoke, which was not, I thought, an ideal foundation for a marriage. He was not unkind to any of them. This is what I want to be clear about. Alastair was not cruel. He was simply very still and very contained, and when he looked at you, there was a quality to the attention that some people found overwhelming and most people found disconcerting. The young women he spoke to were not used to being looked at rather than looked through, and it unsettled them. By the end of the second hour, I could see that he had decided to leave. I could always tell. There was a particular quality of stillness that came over him, a kind of internal gathering, as though he were collecting himself back from the room and the noise and the lights into some quieter inner country. When he went still like that, the evening was over. He found me near the supper table at 10:30. "I am going," he said. "The carriage is at the north entrance. Harkins has it." He nodded briefly and was gone. I watched him move across the room, not quickly, because Alastair never hurried, as though hurrying would constitute an admission that something in the room had the power to affect him, and then he was through the side corridor and out of sight. I thought, as I turned back to my champagne, that that was the end of it. I was wrong by exactly the length of one very eventful carriage ride. I did not learn the details until the following morning. Alastair was at breakfast when I came down. He was always at breakfast before me, another of his qualities that I found quietly irritating. And he was drinking his coffee and reading correspondence in a way that suggested, to the untrained eye, that nothing unusual had occurred. But I had trained eyes. He was not reading the correspondence. He was looking at it. There is a difference. Reading requires something to move in the face, a small processing, a response. Looking is what you do when you are somewhere else entirely. "Good morning," I said and sat down. "Edmund, how was the journey home?" There was a pause, a very small one, but Alastair's pauses were never small in content, only in duration. "Eventful," he said. I put down my cup. "Tell me." He had gone out through the north entrance, as I had told him. The carriage was where I said it would be, Harkins on the box, the door held open, the interior dark and blessedly quiet after 3 hours of Lady Westhaven's chandeliers and musicians. He climbed in. There was already someone inside. She was in the far corner, pressed against the window, wearing a traveling cloak that was rather too thin for the night air, and holding a small bag on her lap with both hands in a way that suggested she had been holding it for some time and had no intention of releasing it. She was not young, or rather, she was not a girl. She was a woman, perhaps 24 or 25, with the kind of face that was not beautiful in the season's currency, but had a quality that he could not, at that moment, immediately identify. She was also clearly surprised to see him. They looked at each other. "I beg your pardon," she said first, which surprised him since it was, by any objective standard, his carriage. "I was told the north entrance, Brently's the livery service." "This is not Brently's," Alastair said. She looked at the interior, then at him, then at the interior again as if the door might have additional information to provide. "Oh," she said, and then after a moment, "Oh dear." "This is a private carriage," he said. "My carriage." "Yes." "I see that now." She did not move. This was the detail he would later mention to me, that she did not immediately leap up and begin apologizing, did not flutter or exclaim or press herself out of the door. She simply sat and looked at him and thought about it. "I must have taken the wrong turning. There was a great deal of noise at the east entrance and someone directed me to the north and I thought," she stopped. "I am sorry. This is your carriage and I have no business being in it." She reached for the door handle. "Where are you going?" he asked. She paused, hand on the handle. "I beg your pardon." "Where are you going, at this hour alone with a traveling bag?" "That," she said, with a composure that he found remarkable, "is rather my own concern." He looked at her. She looked back. Most people, when Alistair looked at them in that way, adjusted, reconsidered their sentences, found a reason to glance away. She did not. "It is nearly 11 o'clock, he said. "The streets are not empty of unpleasant possibilities." "No," she agreed, "they are not. I was hoping to find a hackney." "From the north entrance of Lady Westhaven's house." "Yes, well, the plan had some structural weaknesses." He should, he told me, have called for Harkins, directed the man to set her down at the nearest hackney stand, and continued on his way. That was the correct response. The sensible one, the one that involved none of the subsequent complications. "Where are you going?" he said again. She looked at him for a moment. Then, "The Aldgate coaching in." "I have a seat booked on the morning mail coach." "That is on the opposite end of the city." "I am aware of that, yes." He sat back, said nothing for a moment. Then, "I am going north, past Aldgate, in fact. My housekeeper has done it in this carriage any number of times." She did not move. "You would be out of your way in a hackney at this hour," he said, "if you could find one." "I do not think." "I am not proposing anything improper," he said, with the particular flatness he used when he wanted to make something absolutely clear. "I am proposing a carriage ride to the Aldgate coaching inn, which is 40 minutes from here and along my route. Nothing more." She looked at him, he looked back. Outside, the sounds of Lady Westhaven's ball drifted through the window, a burst of laughter, a fragment of music. "You don't know who I am?" she said. "No," he agreed. "Most men who offer a woman a carriage ride know who she is." "I imagine they do," he said. "I am making an exception." There was a long pause. Then she said very quietly, "All right." And she sat back. He told Harkins the route. The carriage moved off into the London streets, and for some time neither of them spoke, which suited Alistair perfectly well. He had had, as I said, 3 hours of a season ball, and the quiet was welcome. She sat in her corner with her bag on her lap and looked out the window, and he sat in his and looked out his, and the carriage rumbled over the cobblestones, and it was, he said, the most peaceful part of the entire evening. Then she spoke. "Are you a relation of Lady Westhaven's?" she asked. "No." "A friend?" "An acquaintance?" A pause. "You did not seem to be enjoying yourself." He looked at her. "No," he said. "Nor was I," she said very simply, and looked back out the window. He waited for the rest of it, the explanation, the complaint, the social architecture that usually followed such a statement, the careful positioning and counterpositioning. It did not come. She had said what she said, and apparently that was sufficient. "Why were you there?" he asked. He was not sure afterward why he asked it. He was not, as a rule, curious about people at balls. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was there because I had accepted an invitation 3 weeks ago before certain circumstances changed. I went because it seemed worse to send a note of regret at the last moment than to attend and leave quietly." A pause. "I did not, in fact, manage the leaving quietly portion." "What happened?" She turned to look at him. There was something in her face that was not quite amusement and not quite pain, a kind of wry composure, the face of someone who had decided that if they could not choose what happened, they could at least choose how they wore it. "I was engaged," she said. "As of last Tuesday, I am not." He said nothing. "There was someone at the ball who was, engaged, I mean, to the man who was, until Tuesday, engaged to me." She turned back to the window. "They looked very happy." The carriage was quiet, wheels on cobblestones. Somewhere outside, a watchman called the hour. "I am sorry," Alistair said. She glanced at him. The look was brief, but it had a quality he noticed, an assessment, a genuine one, checking whether he meant it or was merely performing the appropriate response. He meant it, and apparently she could tell because she nodded once and looked back at the window. "Thank you," she said. "I am sorry, too, mostly for the 3 weeks of arrangements and the dress, which is very expensive and which I now have no occasion to wear." A pause. "That is not entirely true." "I am sorry for rather more than that. But the dress seems like a manageable thing to be sorry about, so I am focusing on that at present." He almost smiled. He was aware of it, the movement in his face, the small internal shift. He suppressed it, not because he disapproved of it, but because he was out of practice and it felt foreign. "A sensible approach," he said. "I have been told that I am occasionally sensible," she said, without any particular pride or irony, "when I am not boarding the wrong carriages." He could not remember, he told me, when it had happened. They had been talking, not much, but with a certain ease that he had not expected, the kind of conversation that did not require management, that did not have any agenda underneath it. And then he had looked across and she was asleep. Not performatively asleep, not the careful, ladylike dozing that one occasionally saw at long dinners, the closed eyes and the maintained posture. She was genuinely, entirely, thoroughly asleep, with her head tipped sideways and her bag sliding slightly in her lap, and her mouth just barely open and her face, which had been composed and careful all evening, entirely unguarded. The carriage had shifted, and she had shifted with it, and her head had come to rest against his shoulder. He sat very still. He was aware with absolute clarity of every relevant propriety. He was a stranger. She was unchaperoned. The appropriate response was to shift gently to wake her to restore the correct social geography. He knew all of this. He did not move. He sat there in the dark of the carriage in the London night, with a woman he did not know asleep on his shoulder, and he was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely uncertain about what he felt. It was not desire, or not only that, though he would not have been honest if he denied there was something warm in the fact of her closeness, her weight, the smell of her hair. It was something else, something quieter. It occurred to him that he could not remember the last time someone had been comfortable enough in his presence to simply fall asleep. The Aldgate coaching inn was 40 minutes from Lady Westhaven's house. He did not wake her. He sat in the dark and let the carriage move, and the streets of London passed outside the window, and she slept on his shoulder without any awareness that she was doing something that, by any reasonable accounting, should have been impossible given the reputation of the man she was sleeping on. And he thought, for 40 minutes in the dark, with unusual clarity. When the carriage stopped, he was not at Aldgate. He had redirected Harkins quietly, without waking her, somewhere around the Strand. He was not entirely sure when he had made the decision. He was not entirely sure he had made it in any conscious way. He had simply been sitting there in the dark with her asleep on his shoulder, thinking, and the thought had arrived fully formed. She has a seat on the morning mail coach. It is not yet midnight. It is a cold night. There is no reason she needs to spend 4 hours in a coaching inn. Strathmore House was 20 minutes away. The guest rooms were always prepared. Mrs. Alderton was a woman of consistent habits. She could sleep. She could have breakfast. She could take a later coach if she chose, or an earlier one, and he could have the carriage take her anywhere she wished. He had been very careful, telling himself all of this, to keep the reasoning entirely practical. He was not, he admitted to me, being entirely honest with himself. When the carriage stopped, she woke. Immediately and completely, not the gradual surfacing of someone who sleeps deeply, but the snap awake of someone who had been sleeping anxiously, listening for things even in sleep. She sat up. She was for a moment not certain where she was, and then she was aware of where, specifically, she had been sleeping, and her face did something complicated. She said, and then stopped, and then I fell asleep. Yes, he said. She stopped again. Yes. She looked at him, he looked back. He expected embarrassment, the burning kind, the kind that leads to excessive apology and an urgent need for escape. Instead, she sat with it for a moment, and then she said, in a voice that was very measured and a little dry, I would like to note that I am not generally in the habit of doing that. No, he agreed, I rather imagine not. This is not Aldgate, she said, looking out the window. No, it is Mayfair. A pause. We appear to have gone in the wrong direction. Not wrong, he said. I redirected the carriage. You were asleep, and it seemed unnecessary to. He stopped. Found that the sentence, which had made perfect sense in his head, was more difficult to complete than he had expected. The coaching inn is cold at this hour, he said instead. My housekeeper will have a room prepared. You can leave in the morning. She looked at him for a long moment. He could not read it, which he was not accustomed to. He was generally very good at reading people, had spent 20 years training himself to it, and she was doing something in her face that was entirely her own and that he did not have a framework for. You are a stranger, she said. Yes. I don't know your name. No. And you are proposing that I sleep in your house. In a guest room, he said, with the particular flatness he used when he wanted to make something absolutely clear. Under Mrs. Alderton's roof, who is the most respectable woman in 3 counties, nothing more. She looked out the window, then back at him, then out the window again. Why, she said. He thought about it. He could have given her the practical reasons. He had arranged them neatly. But she was, he had established by now, someone who could tell the difference between a reason and the reason, and he found that he did not want to be dishonest with her. Because, he said, you have had a very bad week, and there is no reason you should also have a cold night and a coaching in on top of it. She was quiet for a moment. You don't know that it was a bad week, she said. I told you about Tuesday. The rest of it might have been perfectly fine. Was it? A very long pause. No, she said, it was not. He nodded. She looked at the window. He looked at his hands. All right, she said, for the second time that evening. And he felt, in an irrational and completely inexplicable way, as though she had given him something. Mrs. Alderton was not surprised. This was one of her most valuable qualities. She answered the door at midnight with the equanimity of a woman who had seen sufficient variation in the late-night arrivals at Strathmore House. Messengers, solicitors, at least one entirely unauthorized horse. That a young woman in a traveling cloak registered as merely an addition to the existing catalogue. She took one look at the situation, said, I'll have the East Room made up, Your Grace, and directed the appropriate instructions at the appropriate members of the household with the quiet efficiency of a general who had planned for this contingency already. It was in that moment, of course, that the woman understood who he was. He saw it happen. She had been following Mrs. Alderton into the entrance hall, looking around with the careful, non-committal attention of someone who was noting their surroundings without wanting to appear to note their surroundings. And then Mrs. Alderton said, Your Grace, and the woman stopped. Slowly, she turned and looked at him. He met her eyes. Yes, he said very quietly. She stood in the hallway of Strathmore House and looked at him, and he could see the calculation happening, the reevaluation of the evening, the carriage, the conversation, the sleeping, all of it, through the new lens of who he was and what that meant, and what she might be thought to be in this house at midnight. I should not have agreed, she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Nothing has changed from what I told you, he said. Mrs. Alderton's roof, a guest room, a carriage in the morning wherever you wish to go. She looked at him for a long moment. He held it. He had learned over 20 years not to flinch from people's scrutiny, but this was different. He was aware, in a way he had not been accustomed to, of wanting the scrutiny to resolve in a particular direction. You were right that I don't know who you are, she said at last. I knew nothing about you when I agreed, but I do know that you sat in a carriage for 3 hours without waking me. A pause. People don't do that. No, he agreed. They generally don't. Why did you? He had been asking himself the same question since Aldgate. He had the practical answers assembled. He set them aside. You seemed, he said carefully, to need the sleep. She looked at him. Then very slowly something in her face shifted, not a smile exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had the same warmth without the performance. Strathmore, she said, the Highland Duke. Yes. They call you the Cold Duke. They do. She considered him. I fell asleep on you within 40 minutes of our acquaintance, she said. Make of that what you will. And she turned and followed Mrs. Alderton up the stairs. He did not sleep much that night. This was not, he told me, because he was agitated or because he was plotting anything or because he was doing anything he would later regret. He was simply sitting in his study with the fire going and thinking, which was what he did when something had happened that required genuine thought. What was the woman's name? He didn't know, she hadn't said. He hadn't asked. It seemed now like a remarkable omission, though he was not sure which of them it reflected more oddly on. She was a debtor's daughter. This he had gathered from the conversation, a reference to bills that had become rather more pressing after the engagement dissolved. A comment about the house in which she and her father lived being currently in some negotiation, which in his experience translated to an outstanding debt of some size. She was intelligent and self-possessed. She had been engaged to a man who had, apparently, found someone preferable, and she had attended the ball at which this man's new attachment was present, and she had managed it with more dignity than he imagined most people could. She had fallen asleep on his shoulder. He sat with that, in the particular way he sat with things that he could not quite categorize and did not want to dismiss. In the morning, he would ask her name. In the morning, she would take a carriage wherever she wished to go. That was what he had said, and he was a man who said what he meant. But sitting in the study at 2 in the morning, he was already aware, with the particular certainty that comes when your own reasoning has become unreliable, that wherever she wished to go was a question he cared about the answer to. Breakfast was, by Strathmore House standards, a quiet meal. Mrs. Alderton had understood, without being told, that the East Room's occupant might prefer to come down when she chose rather than at the customary time, and so there were no formal breakfast arrangements, merely a sideboard and a fire and the morning light coming in through the long windows, and the kind of patient quiet that the house maintained as though it had been designed for it. She came down at 8:30. She had repaired herself. The traveling cloak was gone, replaced by the dress she had worn the night before, which in daylight he could see was not actually the ball gown but a simple dark dress beneath, the kind that could be worn in layers for travel. Her hair was pinned more carefully than it had been the previous night. She looked in the morning light in his breakfast room entirely herself, which was a quality he had noticed the night before and now confirmed. She was not, in daylight, a different person than she had been in the dark carriage. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he stood. She waved a hand, brief and practical, to indicate that this was unnecessary. He remained standing for a moment out of habit, then sat. She helped herself to the sideboard with the composure of someone who had decided to be comfortable or to appear to be, and sat down across the table. "I should like to know your name," he said. She looked up, a small pause. "Considering that I have now slept in your house, I suppose that is reasonable." A beat. "Miss Emmeline Foss." "Foss," he repeated. "My father was a solicitor, retired." A very small pause that contained some quantity of information about the nature of that retirement. "We had some ambitions for a better arrangement. The ambitions have been somewhat revised." She said this with the wry composure that he was coming to recognize as her characteristic register, not performance, not bitterness, just a clean accounting of the facts. "And you are the Duke of Strathmore." "Alistair Calloway." "The Highland Duke." "If you prefer." She looked at him with the appraising look that he had first seen in the carriage, the one that seemed to be checking not for rank or wealth, but for something more fundamental. "How did you find Lady Westhaven's ball, Your Grace?" "Tedious," he said. "It was rather, though I suspect for different reasons." He waited. "I spent most of the first hour being looked at," she said, "in the way that people look at something that has had misfortune, which is a very specific kind of looking. Half pity and half interest and a certain relief that it is not happening to them." "Yes," he said, "I know that look." She glanced at him. "You do?" "When you are the object of a great deal of attention, most of it informed by things that are not true," he said. "You learn to recognize when you are being viewed rather than seen." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Yes, that is exactly it." They looked at each other across the breakfast table in the morning light, and he had, for the second time in 12 hours, the disorienting sensation of being understood by someone who should not have had the information necessary to understand him. "The morning coach from Aldgate," he said. "When does it leave?" "There is one at 10 and one at noon." "Where are you going?" She looked out the window. The London street was moving into its morning business, carts, a crossing sweeper, the distant sound of a vendor. "My aunt in Derbyshire has offered to have me for a time." A pause. "She is kind, and the house is small, which makes it manageable." "And your father?" A beat. "My father is managing the situation in London, the negotiations." She said this in a way that made it clear the negotiations were not going well, and that she did not think they would, and that she had made her peace with it or was in the process of making it. "I am not needed for the negotiations. I am, in fact, rather in the way of them." He absorbed this. Then the noon coach. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon." "Take the noon coach. There is no reason to hurry." He looked at his coffee. "Unless you wish to." She considered him. He was aware of the consideration. It had a texture to it, thorough and careful. You are being very kind, she said at last, for a man who is known as the cold Duke. I am occasionally kind, he said, when there is a reason. And what is the reason this morning? He thought about it. He could have given her the practical reasons again. He set them aside again. I find, he said, that I would prefer you to stay to breakfast. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said for the third time, and reached for the toast. She did not take the 10 o'clock coach. She did not take the noon coach, either, though this was largely because they were still talking at noon, which was not something he had anticipated and which he suspected, from a small quality of surprise in her face, she had not anticipated either. They had been discussing, of all things, estate management. It had begun with an oblique reference she made to the complications of entail in cases of debt, which had led to a comment from him about the particular frustrations of the 1840s debt relief legislation, which had led to the discovery that she had opinions about debt relief legislation that were both better informed and more interesting than his solicitors. Your father, he said, around 11:30, was a solicitor, she said. For 30 years, I grew up reading his briefs when he wasn't looking. That explains it. Does it bother you? She asked, with the directness that he was now entirely accustomed to and no longer found surprising, only clarifying. To be discussing estate law over breakfast with a woman who has no particular business knowing about it. No, he said, quite honestly. I find it considerably more interesting than the alternatives. She smiled then. Not the adjacent to a smile thing he had seen the night before, but an actual smile, brief and genuine, and it changed her face in a way that he noted with a precision he would not have been able to explain. The noon coach, she said. There is one at 4 as well. She looked at him, he looked back. Stay to luncheon, he said. And this time he did not dress it in practicality, because it was not practical, and she would have seen through that immediately, and he was not willing to be dishonest with her. She did not say all right. She said yes. I will not reproduce the whole of the afternoon, because I was not there and I have only his account of it. And Alistair, even to me, even about the most significant things, is not a man who narrates at length. What I know is that they talked, that Mrs. Alderton brought lunch and then tea, and then, at some point in the late afternoon, lit the lamps in the sitting room because neither of them had noticed it getting dark. That she told him about her father's practice, and the engagement, and what it had felt like to sit across a dinner table from a man who had already decided she was insufficient. And he told her, which still strikes me, knowing him, about the years after our father died, and the accounts, and the particular loneliness of being 20 years old and a duke and very much alone with it. She said at some point in the late afternoon, You have been managing things for a very long time. And he said, Yes. And she said, Is there anyone who manages things for you? And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Not as yet. She looked at him, he looked back. The lamps were lit and the sitting room was warm, and outside it was a London autumn evening. I will have to go, she said. Yes. Tomorrow, she said, there is a 9 o'clock. I will have the carriage take you to Aldgate. She looked at her hands. He looked at the fire. They sat in the sitting room in the quiet for a moment, and then she said, You sat in the carriage for 3 hours without waking me. Yes, he said. Why? He had been sitting with this question for 18 hours now. He had the honest answer ready because he had been practicing it, which was not something he had ever done before with anything. Because, he said, I did not want to. She was quiet for a long time. I have to go to Derbyshire, she said. I know. My aunt is expecting me. Yes. She looked at the fire. I do not know if I will be in London again soon. I know Derbyshire, he said. Reasonably well. She looked at him. It is not a large county, he said, and there was something in his voice that he had not heard there in a long time, something a little less careful. And I have occasion to pass through it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, quietly, I fell asleep on your shoulder within 40 minutes of our acquaintance. Yes. People don't do that. No, he said, they don't. I think, she said very slowly, that I was comfortable. He held that, let it exist in the air between them. Then, you could be, he said, if you chose it. She looked at him for a long time. Yes, she said at last quietly, I think I could. The 9 o'clock coach left without her. Not because of him, he did not ask her to stay, had said what he had said and left it entirely in her hands, as it was her hand to play. She came down to breakfast at 8:30 with her bag and her traveling cloak and her composed, careful face, and he was at the table and he rose when she came in and they looked at each other. "The carriage is ready," he said. "Yes," she said. A pause. "I would like," she said, "to write to you from Derbyshire." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I would like that. And if you have occasion to pass through Derbyshire." "I will have occasion," he said very simply. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded once and picked up her bag, and he walked with her to the carriage, and Harkins held the door, and she climbed in, and the carriage moved away down the Mayfair street in the morning. He stood on the step and watched it until it turned the corner. Mrs. Alderton, who had appeared at some point during this without any visible evidence of arrival, said, "A very agreeable young woman, Your Grace." "Yes," he said. "Very sensible. Extremely." A pause. The East Room is always prepared. He looked at her. She looked back with the expression of a woman who had been managing the affairs of the Calloway family for 23 years and felt that gave her certain privileges. "Thank you, Mrs. Alderton," he said. She nodded and went inside. He stood on the step for a moment longer in the morning air. Then he went in after her. He did have occasion to pass through Derbyshire. He had occasion, in fact, within 6 weeks, which was slightly more urgency of occasion than was strictly explainable by the ordinary demands of his schedule. But he had decided, somewhere between the sitting room on the evening she stayed and the Mayfair step on the morning she left, that he had spent 20 years being very careful about what he let himself want, and that the results had been a cold and tidy and perfectly organized life that he did not particularly wish to continue. She had written 3 letters by then. He had written 4. They were, I have read them because she kept them, and she showed them to me years later with a composure that I found entirely characteristic. Not love letters, not exactly. They were correspondence. They were 2 people talking, which was what they had been from the beginning, and the talking had a quality that the letters maintained. No pretense, no performance, no management. He arrived at her aunt's house in Derbyshire on a Thursday afternoon in November, and she came out to meet him in a sensible coat that was not the thin traveling cloak, and they stood on the front step of her aunt's small house and looked at each other. "You had occasion," she said. "I did." "What occasion, precisely?" "I am calling on Miss Emmeline Foss of Derbyshire," he said, with the particular deliberateness he used when he wanted there to be no ambiguity. "That is the occasion." She looked at him, he looked back. "Come in," she said. "My aunt will want tea." Her aunt, a widow of 60 and remarkable perception, had tea ready with the efficiency of a woman who had read the letters over Emmeline's shoulder, which she had not, but had apparently reached the same conclusions by some other method. She was small and brisk, and looked at Alistair with the evaluating attention of someone whose niece had been burned once, and was not inclined to allow it to happen again. And he sat under this scrutiny with the patience of a man who had nothing to hide, and was willing to wait as long as was necessary to prove it. She decided, apparently within the first quarter hour, because her manner shifted, not warmly, not yet, but to a kind of watchful acceptance that he recognized as the first installment of trust. After tea, she found reasons to be elsewhere, which he respected. He stayed for 3 hours. They walked in the garden, which was small and cold and November bare, and talked about estate law again at one point, because she had been reading something in her aunt's library and had a question, and he answered it, and she said, "I thought so," with a satisfaction that he found entirely disproportionate in how pleased it made him. "I would like to call again," he said before he left. "Yes," she said, "I thought you might." "Next week." She looked at him. "That is a great deal of occasion." "Yes," he said, "I find I have a great deal of it." A pause. Then, with the wry composure that had not changed since the first night, "The road is better in dry weather." "I will come in dry weather." "It rains a great deal in Derbyshire." "Then I will come in the rain." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "All right." He asked her father in January. The meeting with Mr. Foss, a man in his 60s, thin and intelligent and visibly worn by the preceding year, who received Alastair in a study that contained rather more furniture than a study of that size comfortably permitted, was not an easy one. Mr. Foss was not a man who was inclined to be overwhelmed by rank, which Alastair found he respected, and was disposed to make his own assessment, which he respected more. "I have debts," Mr. Foss said at one point, not in the manner of a man confessing them as a defect, but in the manner of a man stating a relevant fact. "I know," Alastair said. "I will not have my daughter's marriage used as a correction to my accounts." "No," Alastair said, "neither will I." A pause. Mr. Foss looked at him over his spectacles. "She is not going to be a suitable duchess in the conventional sense. She has opinions." "Yes," Alastair said, "I have noticed. They are not always welcome ones." "They are always accurate ones," Alastair said. "I find that more useful." Another pause longer. "She fell asleep in your carriage," Mr. Foss said. He had heard the story from Emmeline, and it was clear from his expression that he had not known what to do with it. "Yes," Alastair said. "That is not," said Mr. Foss, "a conventional beginning." "No," Alastair agreed, "it is not." Mr. Foss looked at him for a very long time. Alastair held it. "She is happier," Mr. Foss said at last. "Since October, there is a difference. It is not the sort of thing a father can easily—" He stopped, tried again. "She is happier." "Yes," Alastair said, "I intend her to remain so." Mr. Foss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will speak to her." He spoke to her. She spoke to Alastair. And what she said to him in the cold January garden of the London house where she had returned for the conversation was this: "I am going to say yes. But I want you to know something first. Yes, I am not going to manage my opinions for the benefit of your position, or adjust my manner for the benefit of society, or pretend to be something quieter than I am, because it makes things easier for a duchess. No," he said, "I know. And I am going to need you to be honest with me. Always, not managed, not careful, honest." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "You are not as cold as they say." "I know." "The cold Duke," she considered him. "You just needed someone who wasn't afraid of you." "Perhaps," he said, and there was something in his voice that he was making no particular effort to contain. "Or someone who fell asleep on me." She looked at him for a moment. Then the smile came, the real one, brief and genuine and entirely her own, and she said, "Yes." They were married in March. It was a quiet ceremony, because Alastair had no interest in spectacle and Emmeline had even less, and Mrs. Alderton organized the breakfast at Strathmore House with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had seen this coming since approximately midnight on a Tuesday in October and felt vindicated. I was best man, which was not, in truth, a difficult role to fill. I stood beside Alastair in the church and watched him look at Emmeline as she came in, and I will tell you only this about that moment. I had known him for 30 years, and I had not in those 30 years ever seen him look like that. Not at a person, not at a piece of land, not at anything. It was the look of a man who had been very alone for a long time, and had not allowed himself to know how alone until there was suddenly the prospect of not being. She looked back at him in precisely the same way. The vicar said the words. They said the words back. He slid the ring on her finger with the steadiness that was characteristic of him, and she held his gaze without looking away, and it was over, and they walked out of the church into the March morning, and she put her hand through his arm in the practical, easy way that was entirely her own. "The cold Duke," she said very quietly as they walked. "The Highland Duke," I offered from behind them. "I prefer," said Emmeline, "Alastair." He looked at her. There was, at the corner of his mouth, something that I had seen perhaps a dozen times in 30 years. "Yes," he said, "I prefer that too." They had 31 years together in the end. She was, as her father had predicted, and as Alastair had entirely accepted, not a conventional duchess. She was opinionated, and she said so, and she was right often enough that people stopped minding, or at least stopped arguing. She organized the Strathmore tenants into a set of arrangements that proved significantly more efficient than the previous ones. She ran the household accounts with a precision that made even the solicitors respectful. She told Alastair when he was wrong, and he was occasionally wrong, and she did it with the same wry, composed directness with which she had first told him. he had gone the wrong direction from Aldgate. He listened every time. I have been to Strathmore House at Christmas, at harvest time, at midsummer, and I have watched them across 31 years of those visits, and the thing I notice, consistently, every visit is that they are comfortable. Not in the settled, dull way that some long marriages become comfortable, but in the carriage at midnight way, the way that suggests that these two people, specifically, are exactly the right size for each other's silence. She tells me, occasionally, that it started because I forced his hand by lying about the legal matter and bringing him to London. I accept this responsibility. He told me once, near the end, when Emmeline had gone ahead of him by 2 years and the house at Strathmore had a quality it had not had in 31 years, that the 3 hours in the carriage were the best 3 hours of his life. Not the first 3 hours at Strathmore, or the dinner at which she corrected his understanding of the enclosure acts, or the walk in the November garden when she had first made him laugh properly, or the wedding morning, or any of the 100 subsequent mornings. The 3 hours in the carriage, in the dark, with a woman he did not know asleep on his shoulder and the London streets moving past, when he had sat very still and let her sleep and thought, for the first time in a very long time, about what he wanted. I did not tell him that he should have woken her. He was right. Those 3 hours were exactly what everything else was made of. I am Edmund Calloway, Lord Haverstock, younger brother to the late Duke of Strathmore, and I am a man who has told this story at dinner parties, club suppers, and one regrettable christening, and I intend to continue doing so. My wife has asked me to stop. She is right about most things, but not, I think, about this one. Some stories deserve to be told. This is one.